Introduce you, please, live from Vancouver in Canada, Dr. Leith Davis, Professor, Department of English, and the Director of the Center of Scottish Studies at Simon Fraser University. And of course, Leith is going to speak to us on Jacobitism and cultural memory from 1688 to 1820. And Professor Davis, this sounds fascinating. We'll be hanging on your every word. I would like everyone to please mute your microphones and dim your cameras, and I'll help you do that during the presentation. But do stay on for the discussion afterwards when we'll unmute you, open your cameras, and have some informal discussion with the professor. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. And it'd be great if people just want to put in the chat where you're coming from. I'm from Vancouver, as Connie said, so it is a cold Vancouver here. We've had snow and frost for about a week now that hasn't gone away. And so, yeah, and it's early morning. It's 8:10 for me. So I have my coffee in hand and I'm excited to speak to you today. And I will just, oh, wow, hi, Antigonish from Nova Scotia. Nice to see everybody. And Coquitlam, Chicago. Wow, that's great, everybody. Welcome, welcome. So Connie, I'll just share my screen here and I have some visuals that I want to share with you. And as Connie mentioned, I will be speaking today on Jacobitism and cultural memory. So let me just give me a second.
And it looks great. Here. We can see it.
That's
just
good.
Thank
you. And let's just advance it. And is that that still working? Looks to me like you should be able to see the next slide.
Sure
Perfect.
is.
Excellent. I love it when the tech works. Okay, so I want to, before I get started here, just acknowledge that the work for the project that I am going to be talking about is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Here, that's the shared traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And our center works to promote reconciliation here in Canada. So really important to acknowledge that. As Connie mentioned, also, I am a professor in the Department of English, and I'm also the director of the Center for Scottish Studies at Simon Fraser University. We are the only Scottish Studies Center in the West in Canada, and we were started in 1999 by faculty and community members. And there is Rex Davidson, who I saw in the audience there. There's an earlier manifestation of Rex there. This is a center that's currently hosted in the Department of English, and we do research, we do teaching and student training, and we also do public outreach. And I will stick in the chat at the end our Scottish Studies website, so you can tune in and see what kinds of activities that we are engaged in. So a little bit about me, just to contextualize what I'll be speaking about. And really important to know, I am a scholar of the long 18th century literature. So I'm a literary scholar, but I have historical tendencies. And I work then between the period of 1650 and about 1800. I'm particularly interested in Scottish Irish literature and culture, and my previous books have been on Scotland and the literature of Scotland and the music of Ireland, music and culture of Ireland, on Robert Burns, and also on transatlantic diasporic Burns in particular. I'm also a scholar of media history. So for the 18th century, those media are oral, handwritten, and print, and that'll be really important in what I say today. So I am interested in how communication happens and how literature gets mediated in a multi-platform way in the 18th century. More recently, I've been focusing on what's called cultural memory studies and just just in case people aren't familiar with that, cultural memory studies, we look at the collective practices that societies use to build and uphold their relationship to the past. So living in the present and also preparing for the future. So how groups basically form their memories of who they are and what makes them what they are. So we look at particular events of the past, how they're created, selected, circulated, and modified by social collectivities. That can be nations, religions, other kinds of groups. So that's what I'm focusing on, and that is what has led to my research. Today, I have a four-part talk, and I'll begin just with a little history of the Jacobites, some background on Jacobitism, just to fill us in on that historical time period and some of the events that were happening. I'll kind of switch gears to talk a little bit about changes in the 18th century media landscape. And in particular, I'll be looking at the shift to the new media of the time. And the new media in the 18th century was print. So the print marketplace and the development of that. I'll talk a little bit about the impact of this change to print on what we think of as cultural memory. And then I'll connect that all together into looking at how we can understand the cultural memory of Jacobitism through looking at the changes in the media environment. So that's the game plan for today. And I'll just say that I'm drawing here on material and work that I've done in my previous book, Mediating Cultural Memory in Britain and Ireland, from the 1888 Revolution to the 1745 Jacobite Rising. And that was published in 2022. And just have had a new book published, and that's Jacobitism and Cultural Memory, 1688 to 1830. So I'll be drawing on material from both of those works as we go forward. All right, let's start with a little bit of background. And I have to say, kind of grateful to Diana Gabaldon for making Jacobitism a word that people are familiar with. When I say I work on Jacobites, a lot of people know about that because of Outlander, both the books and the television series. But I also want to make sure that we have some of the facts of the situation. So I'm going to fill you in a little bit on the background, and some of you may be very familiar with this. For others, this is just a little bit new. So we are going to start back in 1685. An important thing to know about 1685 is that it's when James II and VII came to the throne in Scotland, England, and Ireland. Now, he's called James II because he was the second king who was called James in England. He's also called James VII in Scotland because there were 6 James previously to that. So this is a time period that is just after the unsettled time in the British Isles with civil wars, the beheading of King Charles I, a stretch of time when there was rule by Parliament, and then the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II. So just the take-home point there is it has been a very unsettled century before this point. James II, VII is Charles I's son and Charles II's brother. So the other thing that's important to know about him is that he became a Catholic. And he begins a period of re-Catholicization in England, as well as attempting to gain toleration for Catholics and other minority religious groups. And just say here, he was a friend of William Penn, for example. So he is advocating for religious tolerance at this time. And this was not popular. People were very suspicious of Catholics. There had been previous wars between Protestants and Catholics, and England had settled into being Protestant. So there was a real pushback about that Catholicization that was happening. However, people were biding their time until June 10th, 1688. James and his wife, Mary of Modena, had a son at that point. Mary gave birth to James Francis Edward Stuart. Now, at this point, what that means basically is that they're going to be a Catholic heir, and that Catholic heir is going to become a Catholic king on the throne. James had two daughters with his previous wife, who had died, Anne Hyde. They were both Protestant. That's Mary and Anne. And so this was a game changer, because this meant basically England was going to be continuing to have a Catholic monarch. Now, at this point, a group of English nobles, nobiles, just make that correction, contacted the Dutch prince, William of Orange, who was married to Mary, James's oldest Protestant daughter. And they basically invited him to come over to England. And William was quite happy to do that, because he had his own reasons militarily for doing that. He landed with a fleet, basically an armada. He landed in Torbay in Devon, and he embarked on a march towards London. This became known later as the Glorious Revolution. And we know from the time that it wasn't so glorious. For example, if you lived in Ireland, there was a lot of bloodshed that happened, but that's the name that it has got in cultural memory. So upon the march of William to London, James and his wife and son flee, and William and Mary are crowned co-regents, king and queen, in 1689. That's interesting, co-regents, right? So that Mary is still blood connected to James. William is married to Mary. He also happens to be James's nephew. So at this point, then, 1688, huge game changer in Britain at this time. And important to know, this is the beginning, because there were a group of people that were not supportive of the regime change. And those people became known as Jacobites. That's after the Latin for James, Jacobus. So that's the origins of Jacobites. And we trace it back to 1688 here. Also, important to know that those Jacobites were of multiple interests, and they kept up the activities of trying to return the Stuarts to the throne between 1688 and 1746, and a little bit beyond as well. So there was constant Jacobite activity as they're trying to restore the king, the Stuart throne. There were Jacobites in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Wales. Those Jacobites had different aims in supporting the Stuarts. There were Catholics and Protestant Jacobite supporters. So they're quite a mixed bag, and they have their own interests in getting the Stuarts back on the throne. But again, important to know, and I'm quoting here from, somebody's, do you mind just muting your microphone? That would be great, thanks. I'm quoting here Daniel Shecky, who is a Jacobite scholar, historian, who points out that on average, there was a serious Jacobite-related event in the British Isles every 1 to 2 years between 1689 and 1722, and every 3 to 4 years between 1740 and 1760. So we think of that as a settled time. In fact, when we look at the Jacobites, it was very unsettled. You may have heard of the important risings that took place in there, the 1715 to 16 Jacobite rising, where that baby, James Francis Edward Stuart, was the pretender, as he was called, to the throne. And he arrived in Peterhead, December 22nd, 1715. That Jacobite rising was suppressed. However, it was extremely popular. It also took over in place in several different that Jacobite rising was not just one rising, it actually happened in multiple locations around Britain. The one they were probably most familiar with is the 1745 to 46 Jacobite Rising. And this was led by James II's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart. So James the Pretender, James VIII's son. And on that Jacobite Rising, the Jacobites marched as far into England as Derby. They turned back on December 4th. After a series of victories, they eventually ended up turning back, going to be defeated at the Battle of Culloden on April 16th, 1746. So that was the significant battle that decimated the Jacobites. And the aftermath of that battle, the government really intended to wipe out the Jacobite cause once and for all. So there was a series of draconian measures that were undertaken in the aftermath of that battle. By late spring of 1746, there were over 3,000 Jacobite men, women, and children who were imprisoned and kept on transport ships because the prisons were so full. There were so many people that were in the justice system that there was there was a lottery system for trials, and men would draw straws, and the person who 1 out of 20 would go to trial. The rest were transported to the West Indies and to the Americas. There were also a number of executions. And remember, executions in this time for treason were brutal. It's hanging, drawing, and quartering. So there were ordinary men as well as celebrity executions. There were 3 lords who were also executed: the rebel lord, so-called Kilmarnock Balmerino, and Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat. So it was a time of real attempts, as I was suggesting, to eradicate the Jacobites. And because the Jacobites were so closely connected in the government's understanding with the Highland culture, there was also an attempt to eradicate Highland culture. So the acts of prescription, including a Dress Act, were passed. There was an attempt to eliminate what were called heritable jurisdictions, to disrupt the clan system and the connection between the clan chiefs and his men. This was an attempt then to change the culture, eradicate the culture, and to wipe out the Jacobite cause. Now, I should say as well, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, escaped from Scotland after 5 months of basically being hidden. It was quite a heroic and adventure. He went and eventually died in Rome in 1788. So those are some of the facts of the Jacobite risings. So important takeaways there. This was something that happened over a period of time. This was something that happened all over Britain, not just in Scotland, but also Ireland, England, and Wales too. And it was something that was ultimately suppressed by the government after 1746, brutally suppressed at that point. Okay, hopefully you're with me still. I'm going to make a bit of a change here. And I'm going to be looking now at the changes in the 18th century media landscape. And I call it landscape because I think of media as an ecosystem that work together, the way that we have, for example, digital platforms, we have print platforms, we have face-to-face communication, and we have written communication. So those all work together as a landscape of media. And it's important to know, as I suggested, there's a new medium of the day, new game in town, and that is print. And just to be specific here, I'm not talking about the advent of print, which of course happened several centuries early, but what I am talking about is the print marketplace, where there's significant changes in the number of people who have access to and who use print. So in the words of critics Clifford Siskin and William Warner, print came to take center stage within an already existing media ecology of voice, sound, image, and manuscript writing. So we think of print then as taking on a more primary role in people's everyday lives, whereas they would have been working from day to day with maybe oral and some manuscript if they were literate. With the advent of this print medium taking the center stage, there's really a shift to print becoming something that's used by more people. So if we think of this period that I've just been describing, this active Jacobite period between 1688 to around 1760, the interesting thing about that is it actually corresponds to this important shift in the media landscape, where we are moving to what critics sometimes call print saturation, where print becomes the natural platform where people don't even think about it because it's so ubiquitous. We think of this growth and development of the marketplace for print, then this print saturation. And the question is, what's really behind the change? And this is what fascinates me. I do a lot of work on this. So I just want to indicate a few of the reasons why at this point of time, 1688 to 1760, there was such a huge change. And we can think of it maybe as equivalent to what we are facing today as the shift to the digital platform, where we are more and more moving towards using digitization in our everyday life. And if we think of that as equivalent, people in the 18th century were moving towards using print in their day-to-day lives. So a few things, there's 6, I'm going to go over these really quickly. Happy to expand on any of these in the question period. One of the really important things is that was their end of pre-publication censorship in England after 1695. So according to the laws established by Charles II in the 1660s, if you wanted to print something, you had to get authority. And I don't know if you can see on this London Gazette newspaper at the top, it says, circled in red there, published by authority. So you could not print something without running it by government censors, essentially, before you were able to take it to the press. Speaking of presses, there was also an increase in the number of presses and in the places and locations of those presses in Britain. So just for comparison's sake, in 1705, for example, there were 65 to 70 presses, up from 24 presses in the previous decade. This led to, understandably, an increase in number of works published at all different price points. So not just expensive works, but there was a lot of popular print that was circulating in society. And I'll just give you a quick example. Newspapers published during the 1688 revolution, so that so-called Glorious Revolution. This is the number of newspapers. 1, right? It was the government newspaper. It was published by authority. That was the news that people were getting. By 1715, but by the time of the next big Jacobite rising, this is the number of papers that are circulating. So we can see that this is an exponential increase in papers that people are reading and consuming in order to get their news. And that becomes really important. Associated with this, there's also a huge increase in literacy rates. And we see it's a little bit hard to get a handle on exactly the percentage because it depends on how you define literacy. Is it just being able to write your name, or is it being able to read? And so there's some controversy about how we measured that. But a ballpark, we can look at maybe 1700, possibly 30 to 40%. 1780 is around 60% and possibly even more. And I love this image. This is Hogarth's Beer Alley, because you can see even these women who are selling fish. They've got ballads in their hand that they're looking at, and there are books in the corner here that are being taken to be reused and recycled. And that man with a beer on the left side has got in front of him some print too. So you can see the way that print is really being used in the everyday lives of people. There are also another one of the considerations is there's a lot more effective distribution networks, so postal routes and roads. And that's important because it's not just in one area, but it's all over the nation and into Scotland. There are these distribution of printed works. And finally, and this is also important, there were changes in copyright laws that gave rights to authors, not printers who had them previously for 14 years. And then they could be republished. So there was an increase in the numbers of works that are already being published that could be republished with these kind of changes. All right, so that's kind of a brief overview then of some of those changes. Let's move to look at what is the impact of that overall on what we think of as the creation and the circulation of cultural memory, of how people remember and really accumulate memories around particular events. Okay, well, media scholars talk about this word affordances. And affordances are characteristics that impact what a particular medium can do, how it gets distributed, how easy it is to replicate, who interacts with those kind of questions. So it's a big general term for what we can do with a medium and how it gets used. Maybe a little bit easier to understand if we take an example. Let's take a song for an example. And if we think of the affordances of that song, well, we can think of a song as being open to all. Anybody can sing a song if they are able to speak. There's no cost associated with singing. There's a face-to-face element of singing. You have to be in the same room with the people or the same field in order to be able to hear. And there's also a limited number of people and limited audience that can hear the song at any one time. Each song is a unique iteration. And those of you who are singers or who go to folk song events, when you hear a song, even though it's by the same singer, it's different every time you hear it because the audience is slightly different. It's a different time. It's a unique moment. Each song is different. And finally, songs are very ephemeral. Once they've been sung, oof, there's nothing left. They are gone, vanished, only a memory. Okay, compare that to print. And as an example of print, I'm just going to take The Spectator, which was a popular periodical or newspaper in the early 18th century. Now, if we're talking about a newspaper, a periodical work of print, that requires literacy. So it requires an education in writing and reading in order to understand it. It requires the ability to be produced, requires a press. Costs, there'll definitely be a cost, and they can vary, as I was suggesting, from popular to more expensive price points. Think of this carefully too. Each author is not writing to a particular one person or limited audience, but it's a mediated writer to reader experience. You don't have to be in the same room with the writer in order to consume what they are saying. This is a wide anonymous audience that we're talking about, not people that you necessarily know at all. And this will be really important to what I have to say later, this is a kind of fixed storage. So think of this as a way of storing ideas and concepts, and they are going to be replicated very easily with print. You can take them, replicate them in whole or in part. So it's a very different kind of affordances that we're talking about with print culture. Now, we'll just say each of those media has advantages and disadvantages for certain purposes. If we think again of those affordances, wow, nothing beats the emotional power of a song. But if we're looking for anonymous, wide distribution and replication, wow, you can't go wrong with print. And that certainly has an advantage. And when we're talking about 18th century, the storage and circulation of cultural memory in a print saturated environment, remember, everybody has access to some kind of print. Print has an advantage. It is much more ubiquitous. Okay, so let's tie that together then with what I'm talking about with Jacobitism and cultural memory. Now, remember, as I've said, this active Jacobite period corresponds to an important shift, to the shift to print saturation. That means more people are consuming print. They are much more using it in their day-to-day lives. And so what we see are some interesting imbalances that happen over this time period. Remember, this is the Jacobite time period, and it was not safe in some places to be a Jacobite. So Murray Pittock puts it really well in his book, Material Culture and Sedition. He calls it a criminalized world. You had to be really careful when you're a Jacobite. Now, you didn't want the fixity of print necessarily, right? So for Jacobites, we find a lot of their communication, records of Jacobite memory were more likely to be communicated using more ephemeral or limited audience medium when you could be sure as who was the recipient of your message. So they tended to use manuscript and oral culture rather than print as well. And this is also a really important aspect, which I won't be looking at so much, but which Murray Pittock looks at, and also Neil Guthrie, material object as well. And this is a beautiful Jacobite fan. So something that could be kind of closed up or opened up depending on who is in the room, literally, if you wanted to display your Jacobite affiliations. Okay, I focus on the media that uses words, however, and so I'm going to give you here an example of a Jacobite song, and I love this. I had a great experience last year working in the archives in the National Library of Scotland, and I found these amazing materials. Now, songs being ephemeral, we don't have the songs themselves. They disappear, of course, as I suggested. Nevertheless, we do have these traces of song, and this is one that was written out, and it was obviously, you can see from the lines in this song that's being folded up carefully, opened up many times, because you can see there's little holes, there's places where the paper is crumbled away. And this is a Jacobite song somebody had in their pocket. It's a drinking song, and it reads like this. Come, let us go drink, boys, a health unto our king. We'll drink no more in stealth, boys, let all your glasses ring. For the English must surrender to him they call pretender. God save our faith defender, and James, our lawful king. So this is a Jacobite song that a Jacobite carried in their pocket and brought out during a safe place where they could share it with other people singing the song. Another example here, and this is one close to my heart as well. This is the Lion in Mourning that was put together by an Episcopal minister called Robert Forbes after the 1746 Battle of Culloden. Forbes started collecting Jacobite memories, songs, letters, speeches, etc. And he put them together in this 10-volume, 2,148 page long, handwritten work called The Lion in Mourning. It's an amazing work that he kept secret all during his lifetime. And this is a way where we can find Jacobite memories that were not published. They were written down and they were kept for just exclusive audiences. You can actually, if you have more interest in this, this is one of our research projects at the Centre for Scottish Studies, and working with the National Library of Scotland, we have digitized this. So you can go to our website, and I will again put this in the chat at the end of this talk, and you can see the actual pages, the digitized pages of this amazing work of Jacobite memory. Okay, so just to sum that up, then Jacobites tend to use works, media that are ephemeral or limited or fragile, or that we just don't have a lot of anymore. In contrast, anti-Jacobite pro-government works flooded the print marketplace from 1688 onwards. And I'll just give you an example of this, and this is pro-government, then anti-Jacobite, beginning right from the get-go in 1688 with this work. This is William's declaration of His Highness's William Henry's of the reasons inducing him to appear in arms in the Kingdom of England. This was a pamphlet that William produced in the Dutch Republic and brought over with him to England and circulated, basically saying, don't worry, everybody, I'm not here to take over your land. I just want to help restore the Protestant religion. And William claimed that James was a tyrant, and that he had fallen under the influence of evil Catholic advisors. And so William was there to save England from this evil tyrant. Now, this work was republished 20 times up to 1691. And here is the replication of media, print media. It also appeared in numerous histories before and after William's death. It became a template for the Declaration of Rights that was passed in 1689. And it also was a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. So a really important document. Because it's a document, it can be replicated, it can be reproduced, it can be circulated, it can be, parts of it can be taken out, and it can receive a wider distribution than, say, that song that I was just showing you earlier. Another example, this is from a newspaper, the Daily Courant, in 1715, and this is a particular snippet about this attempt to seize Edinburgh Castle. This was originally appeared in the Daily Courant newspaper. However, I've traced this through multiple replications. It appears, for example, in a history that was published after the suppression of the Jacobite rising in London in 1716. And it also appears in multiple histories. So that one little newspaper snippet gets replicated in all of these histories. You can see how the layers are building up, where that actually begins to become the story, the narrative that people are familiar with. It gets replicated and stored and restored. Final example of this kind of thing, 1746, there was a dispatch that was sent from Culloden battlefield to George in London, King George. That dispatch became a pamphlet, a kind of special, extraordinary newspaper. This was it right here, sent out from George's official residence at Whitehall. This describes the Battle of Culloden in a pro-government fashion. This particular item was also republished numerous times in newspapers, monthly magazines, periodicals, and it was also taken up into contemporary histories and reprinted and reprinted and reprinted well until the end of the 18th century and later. So, important takeaway here, print, you have those affordances of fixity and replication. And when you're talking about cultural memory, and I'll just bring in two other scholars of cultural memory, Anne Rigney and Astrid Earle, it is the reiteration of a story, of a narrative, of an account across different platforms in the public arena. So multiple print replications, internet, commemorative rituals that enables cultural memory to take root in the community. This is the replicative process of print that fixes and stores cultural memory in particular ways so that the narrative, the story, gets taken up and reproduced. So right from the get-go, from 1688, we can see there was really effective pro-government print media writing the narrative of what was happening. Those Jacobite songs, those handwritten accounts didn't have the same uptake that the pro-government printed works did. They minimized these pro-government works, minimized the Jacobite threat, erased Jacobite perspectives, and layered on the cultural memories to tell the story in a pro-government position. Okay, now up to now, this sounds kind of like maybe the story that we all know, right? History is written by the victors. However, one of the really interesting things that I've been working on with my research tells a slightly different story than that, because I also look at printed works of Jacobite memory, and there were some of those as well. They're harder to find, but they are out there. Just a couple of examples. This was a novel that's written 1746, so after the Jacobite Rising in 1746. It's called Alexis, or the Young Adventurer. And it's kind of a story that it's a novel that tells the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie, but it disguises the name. So he is Alexis, he is a prince. And it's a story that tells the Battle of Culloden from the perspective of the Jacobites and really replicates the story. And it was amazingly popular. It was distributed in London and also all over in Europe as well. There were also ambiguous works. So these were designed by people who wanted to turn a profit in the print industry. And the best way to do that is just to market to both parties. So for example, this is a race at Sheriff Muir. And this has ambiguous lyrics in it. So an example, it says, there's some say that we won. This is the battle. Sorry, to contextualize, this is the battle, indecisive battle in 1715, that both the Jacobites and the government claimed that they had won. There's some say that we won, some say that they won, but one thing I'm sure, a battle there was at Sheriff Muir. So this work sits on the fence. You could read this as a Jacobite. You could read this as somebody who was anti-Jacobite. This is an interesting and quite ambiguous work. Those kind of things also circulated. And what I've also been looking at are works that circulated in print that are not overtly Jacobite, but they were used for Jacobite purposes. And again, just one example here. After 1746, there were a number of works that were printed that gave people an account of the trials of the Jacobites. So this one is about the trials of the Jacobite lords. So Kilmarnock, Balmerino, and another lord who was pardoned, Cromarty. Now, they're obviously circulated in order to represent the trial that had happened and the restoration of justice according to the government side. However, in the pages of these, this is from the third edition of this work, they're also included the words of Balmerino in what is an attempt to replicate his handwriting there. You can see it's not just print. This is an attempt to make it look like this is his handwriting. And this was his speech that he delivered from the scaffold that was really announcing the fact that he was going to his grave still a Jacobite and believed in his cause and really supported the Jacobite cause. So within the pages of this pro-government work of print, we find works that would be easily consumed and happily consumed by Jacobites because they are still asserting the Jacobite cause. So interesting ways that I look at what I call these knots of cultural memory, traces of pro-Jacobite works that are still visible in pro-government printed works, and that subsequently get woven into this official narrative. So I looked at this kind of in mediating cultural memory in Britain and Ireland in 2022. And then I also talk about this and take it up in a forum in Jacobitism and cultural memory. And I take the whole idea of cultural memory there further on to 1830, actually, to the point where people are starting to realize that there are no more living people who have lived through the last Jacobite rising. So there's an understanding that that memory is fading out of existence from living memory, and it's just living in print or in people's writings in other ways. So it's an interesting moment, a kind of change. Just quickly, that second work also, I look more at Scots Gaelic perspectives. I look at Irish Gaelic perspectives, and I look at works like Scots Waverley, really important novel that really rebooted the Jacobite cause in the early 19th century. I also look at other writers who were working before Scott, like Anne McVicar Grant and Thomas Campbell, who kind of be erased by Scott's dominant memory. And I look at an interesting phenomenon which hasn't got a lot of research on it yet, and that's 19th century chapbooks. So I found a lot of these chapbooks, cheap little books that were published for popular consumption. They contain stories and songs connected to the Jacobites, and they're really interesting ways that they perpetuate the cultural memory. So I also want to say that my new book, Jacobitism and Cultural Memory, is also available as a free download. It is open access. I think it's really important that the research I do at the university is something that carries beyond just the walls of the university and that is accessible to all. So this is something that you can download as open access. And again, I will share that link in the chat at the end of the talk here. So that's it for me, and thank you for listening. Really great to share those ideas, and I look forward to any questions that you might have as well.
Bravo, bravo. That was indeed, and I will use the word glorious. I feel very inspired and will be ordering these books immediately. Well, if everyone will please unmute and turn your cameras on and engage in some discussion, question, answer with Professor
Yeah.
Davis.
Well, one question I had, Professor Davis, excellent talk, by the way, very
Oh,
revealing.
please just call me Leith.
Leith. Okay. I'm Bruce, by the way.
Hi.
You had a list of the newspapers there.
Yeah.
Most of them were London or England oriented. What was the newspaper status and numbers in Scotland through
Yes,
1745?
that's a great question. So there were about two newspapers, and there was another newspaper that was produced during the 1715 rising. Newspapers, they're a little hard to quantify because they changed names a lot, or they were only published for a couple of months and then they just ceased publication. Um, so we can't be that exact with it, but with Scotland, we know there were a couple of newspapers there, and that there was another one published during the 1715 rising. One of the things I talk about in the cultural media and cultural memory book is just how I think 1715 also changed how people consumed news. 1715 Rising was the first military conflict that had happened in Britain since 1688. And if you remember, I said in 1688 there was only one newspaper. So in 1715 to 16, there are multiple newspapers. People are hungry for news. Up to that point, there had been really a lot of another kind of media that I didn't talk about, but they're called newsletters. So these were written out and sent, distributed to particular people, or they were put in coffee houses where people could read them. And in the early 18th century, handwritten media had more authority than printed material. People believed it more. It's kind of funny, interesting. Yeah. So, but I see a shift happening around this time period because more people, they want to know what's going on. A lot of this is happening in Scotland, foreign places from London. So people are really fascinated to know what's happening. And we see a shift kind of away from the authority that handwritten news has at this point, and newspapers start to be able to tell you the stories in a more complete fashion. They're more fulsome in their stories. So I see that as a bit of a media shift time. So that's a long answer to your short question. There were about 2 to 3 newspapers in Scotland at the time.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, let's
Yeah,
take the Battle of Sheriffmuir, of course, which is a very
yeah,
famous
yeah.
battle in the 15. What was the time delay between the actual battle and when the news would be reported in London newspapers?
Yeah, also a great question. So there were obviously questions of how fast you can get news there, but remarkably, there were also expresses that would be sent. So the battle would happen. Somebody on a horse would ride to a next post, change to a different horse, and then continue on to get to London. So you're talking about a couple of days, really. Yeah. Um, Remarkable. And then those papers would get that news out really quickly. Um, it kind of baffles my mind when I think of, I don't know how many people have been in a press, 18th century press, printer's office, where you have to put together the movable type and you're getting all of the letters together to make a page of news. That takes a long time. For us, they were obviously very fast because some of these were daily papers that were coming out. So that news could get out pretty quickly. So we're talking maybe 3 days, basically. It's kind of remarkable. Yeah, it's sort of
Thank you.
the internet of the time with horses and movable type.
Hello, Leith. This is Scylla. That was wonderfully
Hi,
researched.
Scylla. Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I heard you say, and I may have misheard, that the literacy rate was 60% at uh, at the time. Is that accurate? Is that
Yeah.
and based on certain areas of England and Scotland, or was that an overall?
Yeah, a great question, Scylla. And again, I'm a little wary about, don't quote me on this because it depends on how you are defining literacy. So again, is literacy just the ability to write your name? Is that literacy, or is literacy the ability to read a whole newspaper? And we know women had lower literacy rates than men. We also know Scotland had a higher literacy rate than England because they had parish schools. So there was a wider educational distribution of literacy in Scotland. So it is absolutely, you are right. It is dependent on where you are exactly. It also depends on your gender, your class, etc. And so it's a little hard to say what those specific literacy rates are, but we are seeing a huge increase, like a doubling of the literacy rate during this time period. We're seeing also, it's not just elite education, but there are people who are apprentices, working class people who are using print, using writing in order to function from their day-to-day existence. One of the things I find really interesting is there's all these manuals telling average people how to write letters, which I find fascinating. When you think of it like letters, how many of us how do we learn how to write a letter? Like how to address, what tone to use, how to set things up on the letter itself. If you are new to literacy, learning how to write a letter is the equivalent of learning how to use the internet. It's not something that you kind of take the technology and you instantly know. You have to kind of learn what the protocols are. And so there are all of these cheap, popular, the guide to writing letters, these circulated, they were massively popular, both in Britain and the same, there's the Secretary's Guide that was circulating in Britain, also circulated in America too, where there's also the same kind of literacy that's changing there. So interesting way that we look at certain genres and literary genres of literacy, and we can see just from these works that are being published, people are wanting to learn how to read, how to write.
Thank you, Leith.
Did the monarchy do any publications of things out to the people?
Yes, and that's a great question too. So yeah, that William's declaration, for example, was meant by James II and VII, also tried to use declarations to reach people. Really interesting. His declarations were met with distrust. William's declaration, he had a really effective media campaign for that work that I showed you of his declaration. So coming from the Dutch Republic, there was a lot more print that was produced in the Dutch Republic at the time. There was more of a free press there. So William was very familiar with using print as a kind of propaganda. When he came over, he landed at Torbay, and then he'd sent, up to that point, he'd sent out copies of the declaration all over Britain and Scotland as well. So when he landed at Torbay, it was like this media moment where people distributed these declarations. So he was very canny in the process of promoting himself. James was working kind of with a blunt instrument. There wasn't the same kind of familiarity with the use of print. That monarchs were very distrustful of print. They actually didn't want people to know things. They didn't want people to get news. They only wanted it to be the news from the government. So there was attempts to suppress everything else. So you can see there, James attempting to meet William on the same platform and use the same platform, but just not with the same skill set. And subsequently, when we're looking at William and then the subsequent monarchs, so William and Mary and George I, George II, yeah, then we start to see a ramp up of government produced print that is going to be circulated, that is presenting the government's perspective on things. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. But before that, yeah, it's an interesting, I think of it like, wow, that time period is still a time period when people are coming before the king to petition in person. there's a lot of pageantry, coronations, etc., like that. So there's an attempt to impact people with those kinds of visual spectacle, ways of producing spectacle, as opposed to giving them something to read. And again, this is all connected to that shift. There weren't so many people who were able to read in 1688. That had changed, so the government kind of had to keep up.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a great question. It's not, it's definitely the government is involved in this as well. It's not just people.
Shows the truth doesn't necessarily win.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Cool question. Yeah, fascinating question. Looking at the media, people were pretty distrustful of print for a while. Um, yeah, understandably, and still distrustful of it. So it's kind of like, people were worried about the internet. What happens when everybody gets all that information? Like what happens? How do we find the truth? How do we find the story that's true? It's a fascinating question that we're still struggling with.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Leith. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I'm really looking forward to reading your work, and thank you for making that available to us. You sort of answered my question when you talked about government suppression, but I'm wondering what form that took and what that looked like.
Yeah. Ooh, great question as well. Thank you so much. Yeah, that also could vary. One of the things I found really remarkable when I was doing my research is, as I suggested, was the pro-Jacobite printed works that were circulating. They were circulating, they were popular, they were out there. We still have some of those. That's fascinating to me. Because there were so many measures that were designed to discourage that kind of representation. So that could range from being executed for treason to jail. You could be jailed. You could be kept in jail. It depends on how egregious the work was. If it was anti-government, it's essentially treason because it's imagining the death of the monarch in some way. So it's imagining the overturning of the current monarch, and that's treason. So yes, there were people, there were executions for printers, and jails, and we have accounts of trials that took place. And yeah, printers were also sneaky sometimes. So if it was a Jacobite work, they sometimes would put on a title page. They would put on that it was printed in Europe somewhere, in France, to protect themselves. So they're kind of all ways that it's like a constant whack-a-mole game. The government's trying to suppress everything, but dissident people with politically dissident views are trying to get their message out in other ways. Yeah. Also depended who you knew. That's also really important at this time, right? So if you have friends in high places as a Jacobite, you're more protected.
I'm tracking the Drummond family. I know that they arrived in Virginia sometime around 1750. I'd like to find out more of them, about them, and actually find out if my husband is actually related to any of the generals. What has been published about the Drummond family? Do you know? Where would I start looking?
Yeah, great question. I am not an expert on genealogy at all, but I know the National Records of Scotland has a branch where they do a lot of that genealogical work. So I think if you go to National Records, you should be able to find some help there in tracing your family roots, because a lot of people want to know that. They want to have those connections, understandably, find out where their ancestors came from. So I'm just gonna.
Well, and Professor Davis, if I may interject, I'll just plug our organization here in Illinois. But we have a genealogy forum that meets similar
Oh,
to our
okay. There
history
you go.
forum. And if you go to www.chicagoscots.org, you'll see the genealogy group events as well. And they impart a lot of instruction on how to go about researching genealogy and have expert speakers.
Oh,
They meet quarterly, but if you just go to www.chicagoscots.org, you'll be able to
okay.
attend those events free as well.
Great. There you
And
go.
they're
That's
Zoom.
nice to know. Yeah. Yeah. Fabulous.
I'm a member of
Islam.
that group.
Okay, there you are. Yeah, I love we're finding out all kinds of things about the different Scottish groups all over in Canada and in the United States too. That's great. Nice to be connected to these resources. I'm just going to stick in the chat. So this is a Scottish Studies. There's National Records Scotland, which was what I was talking about earlier. And then this is our Scottish Studies, our website. And let me also put in the link where you want to find out more. You can download my new book. And it's got some great images. One of the things, this is Cambridge University Press's new it's a new platform, really. It's a book that's available digitally, and you can request print copies as well. But the digital has replications, facsimiles, great images. So I was able to use all kinds of images, which you can see. So if you don't want to read it, that's fine. But look at the images, because some of those are really, really wonderful. I had it was just like being, a bit in paradise in National Library of Scotland and also Edinburgh University Library archives, working and looking for these traces of the Jacobites and trying to find and put together the story from the Jacobite perspective, not just from the overwhelming amount of printed works that we have about cultural memory, the Jacobites in cultural memory. And of course, I should also say that that story goes well beyond 1760. So we can take that further, looking at the end of the 18th century in ways that the Jacobites get represented in histories, in poetry. There starts to be a shift in representations of Jacobites. So instead of being seen as hairy, barbaric Highlanders, they start being seen as hardy, loyal, salt of the earth type characters who can be really positive for the British Empire. And so that shift starts in works of literature that I look at, like Thomas Campbell has a poem called Lochiel's Warning, where he basically kind of presents the Jacobites as Democrats at a time of when there was the just after the American Revolution, French Revolution. So the Jacobites kind of reappear as this group of people who are fighting against tyranny. And then Anne Grant, in her poems, really talks about Jacobites like almost like they're closer to nature, they're hardy. She compares the Jacobites and the Highlanders to the population in England, who she sees as basically overly soft. They're not hardy at all. She says they can learn a lot from the Highlanders and from the Jacobites. So once they get over their political perspectives, they can be reincorporated into the nation, and they can become model citizens, and in fact become very influential as people who are loyal and who have that kind of ability to survive in harsh circumstances too. They also make great soldiers. So that starts to impact how they are seen, how the Jacobites are seen, and Highlanders.
Did the churches do anything in terms of publication publicly to try to reach out and tell their stories?
Sorry, did the churches?
Yeah, the church. Yeah.
You mean which church? Sorry, the
Presbyterian, I guess.
Presbyterians and Church of England. Oh yeah, that's a great question, because that's a whole other area to look at, just the ways that sermons also carried political messages at the
Mhm.
time. So there were so many sermons that would be delivered about the crises during the time of the risings, and they would draw upon scripture in order to talk about the Jacobites as this anti-Protestant horde, basically. So they're interesting ways that, of course, they're having an impact on their parishioners.
Mhm.
They're also circulating these kind of ideas. Yeah. And then, of course, wow, this is a complicated question too, because in Scotland, the Episcopalian Church, most Episcopalians were also Jacobites. Episcopalian is the equivalent of the Church of England, but they also happen to be loyal to the Stuarts. So it gets complicated up there. Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful project too. There's also, I was going to see if I can find this book, recent book. If you want to email me, I can put you in touch with some resources that might give you a little bit more of a sense.
Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
the sun is coming out. Wow, it's great.
Well, Dr. Davis, this has been tremendous. It
Mhm.
really fascinating and enriching. Very different than many of the subject matters that we've entertained previously. I would like to, if anyone else has a comment or question for Dr. Davis or the group, please speak up because we'll be closing down the forum very soon.
I have sort of a personal question, if you don't mind. In the picture that was circulated with the information about this upcoming talk, you had on a McIntyre tartan.
Oh, okay.
I'm wondering if you have a McIntyre connection as member of the council, Clan McIntyre.
Well, I don't know if you were here before I started my talk. I said my husband's name is Rob Roy McGregor. So on his side, there's McIntyres,
Okay.
McIntyres and McGregors from the Ottawa Valley.
Very good, thank you.
Anybody else?
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for listening. I know not everybody is I find this absolutely fascinating, and I know some people not their bag, but to me, manuscripts, documents, old newspapers, wow, let me at it. Just so
Well,
thank you for listening.
It's been wonderful, Professor Davis, very enlightening, and I'll be in touch with you soon. I just want to thank everyone for joining every month and keeping our culture, our Scottish culture alive outside of Scotland. And want to thank Gus for being here today and our North Carolinians and everyone. But thank you.
Oh,
We'll hope to
yeah.
see you next month. And until then, be safe, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Yeah.
Thank you. A wonderful presentation today.
I just putting in the chat my my email. If anyone has more questions, I'd really be happy to hear from you.
The North Carolinians are looking forward to the 249th commemoration of the Battle of Moores Creek at the end of this month. So,
Wow.
our own military history.
Oh, how
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah.
What are the dates,
Gosh.
Catherine?
The 22nd and 23rd of February.
And I would also like to mention that Chicago Scots has a YouTube channel where this video can be found for future reference.
That's great. I know I heard from a couple of people who thought 8 o'clock was just too early for them here, so in Vancouver. So, but they wanted to listen to the talk. So, if you don't mind sending me the link, then I'll pass that on to them too.
Absolutely will.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
thanks
think
so much.
if you just Google YouTube and Chicago Scots, you'll find all these, but I'll send it to you.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I look forward to connecting more in the future with Chicago Scots and the sharing resources as well. So really nice to meet everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thanks so much.